Really glad to be engaging with people again this afternoon. I'm going to share my presentation here. So the topic of the presentation is structural change and deindustrialization. I think it will link quite closely with what I'm assuming Hajun would have talked about this morning. In some ways, perhaps this would have fitted well before Hajun's, but he was speaking from Korea with the time difference. So I'm guessing that maybe some of the more policy-oriented topics that he probably would have spoken on will fit well with this, and I think will connect as well with what Antonio and others are going to speak about in the course of the program. So I've divided the presentation into three main topics. Firstly, a kind of introduction and overview of structural change, then looking a bit at deindustrialization. And in this year's lecture, I've actually shortened both of these to bring in a new section on kind of recent developments and implications for industrialization research and policy. So yeah, I know it can be pretty boring to listen to one person, especially when it's over Zoom. I thought just to pause after each of the first two sessions or sections for any questions, comments, or whatever. But please feel free also just to stop me. I'll try and keep an eye on hands, but yeah, also you can just speak, or Barbara, if you see a hand, you can alert me. So feel free just to stop me as we go along if you've got anything to say, to challenge anything, disagree with it, add to it. Yeah, I hope we can at least make it a bit interactive, even though we're not in the same room. And then after the third session, I've planned a bit of a group activity, so I want to leave enough time for that. So I've actually got quite a lot of slides here, but I'm going to skip over them and just watch the time so that hopefully we've got enough time for the group discussion. So let me just dive in then. So as I said, the first part is about structural change. I know for some people, you might already be very familiar with this, and maybe it's just a bit of a refresher. But yeah, this is just by way of kind of background. So yeah, structural change, I guess, has been a key concern of what I've called here like classical development economics, at least since the 1950s and so on. Pioneered in particular by the school of thought associated with Eklak, Prebisch, Hirschman, and so on. And the structural change perspective broadly is looking at or emphasizing the sectoral composition of economies. So what proportion of a country's GDP and employment are made up by different sectors. And here we're talking about sectors as in agriculture, manufacturing, services being the key sectors. And so this sort of structuralist perspective looks at how changes in the sectoral structure of an economy can be a key part of countries, developing countries' development and catch-up strategies, and help them to attain sustained high rates of growth. So a kind of starting point of this perspective is that what may be the sectoral composition of an economy at any point in time is not necessarily the optimal one for growth and development. And so there can be a structural imbalance in an economy in terms of the sectoral composition. And importantly, that structural imbalance can be sustained, can persist over time. It might sound a kind of obvious point, but that recognition in itself is sort of goes against neoclassical assumptions that there would be this kind of equilibrating processes in marginal returns, so that if at any point in time in an economy the sectoral composition of employment and capital was not optimal for growth, then through these sort of natural equilibrating processes, capital and labor would flow to other sectors, so that any kind of suboptimal disequilibrium in the sectoral composition would just be temporary and kind of self-rectifying. So this structuralist perspective is a different approach to that, and suggests that you could have persisting suboptimal composition of factors of production in different sectors. And then this in turn points to the importance of structural change in the composition of economies. And a corollary of that is the need for an active role of the state, because these kind of structural changes won't necessarily happen automatically. So by structural change here, we're talking about a shift really towards higher productivity sectors and activities within an economy. And what's important here in terms of the productivity is that it's not just in terms of a comparison of sectors or activities by levels of productivity. So it's not just a question of like, okay, let's divide output by employment in agriculture and compare that to mining and so on. But importantly, what is the scope in different kinds of sectors and activities for what's called cumulative productivity increases? So productivity increases that can build on and feed into one another in a virtuous circle. So this suggests that structural change, so the shift towards higher productivity activities, is something which is key to development and key to the catching up of developing economies to advanced economies. So this requires both the emergence of new activities as well as new ways of doing old activities. But there are various obstacles and barriers to that, which is part of why these kind of processes don't just happen automatically. Barriers in terms of technology, skills, political economy, and so on. So this is part of the rationale, again, for an active role of the state, and in particular in terms of industrial policy, which is targeted at particular sectors with a view to changing the sectoral composition of an economy. So, as we said, the structuralist perspective emphasizes the shift towards higher productivity activities, and more specifically, from both the structuralist perspective as well as from other strands within heterodox economics, like the Caldorian approach. This is looked at through a sectoral lens. So the sense is that the sectoral composition of an economy is a crucial way of understanding the structure of an economy. And that not only is there a kind of observed tendency for that over time economies generally tend to shift from agriculture to manufacturing to services, just as a kind of stylized fact, but that sectoral composition actually has causal effects back on growth. So this kind of takes the view that yes, there could be heterogeneity within sectors, but even so, there are important common characteristics or common denominators within each sector, and that those common characteristics have relevance for growth. So to put it differently, an additional job or an additional unit of value added has got different effects on an economy's growth depending on which sector it's in. And these kind of approaches specifically see manufacturing as having a special role to play as an engine of growth. There are various characteristics that tend to be associated with manufacturing that I won't go into detail, but just mentioning here. First, in terms of linkages, manufacturing is thought to have stronger intersectoral, in particular backward linkages with other sectors that gives it a stronger growth pulling potential than in other sectors. greater scope for cumulative productivity increases, a particular role for manufacturing in terms of technological advancement. And that's both in terms of innovations and technological progress happening within manufacturing and the spillover from manufacturing to the rest of the economy. And the important role of manufacturing as a key tradable good in terms of alleviating balance of payments constraints. So the empirical evidence, I would say, on balance is fairly strong for these kind of properties have been tested in different ways over time, within countries, across countries, and so on. I see, for example, Tobile's in the call. She's one of the people who's been working on this and adding to this large existing body of literature built up over several decades. So in different ways, researchers have compared manufacturing to other sectors. And I would say if I was to characterize that literature, it broadly finds that manufacturing has that special role to play and a strong growth pulling properties, but there is a lot of variation across countries and across time. And one thing to note is that empirically, it looks like this kind of growth pulling role of manufacturing tends to be weaker now than it was, let's say, in an earlier period, 80s, 90s, or even earlier than that. So, yeah, we'll come to that. So, yeah, just a last slide on before I pause on the kind of structural change approach. My own reflections on this is that it's a sectoral approach. So, in other words, an approach which looks at productivity and looks at the need for change in terms of using sectors as the unit of analysis, remains an approach which is of value. It remains relevant, but it does also have its limits. And in some cases, we need a nuanced approach to this. So I wanted just to mention what I think are a couple of aspects of this, which are all subject to current debates. The first is that there's a lot of heterogeneity within sectors. So yes, there is relevant common denominators within sectors. There are intrinsic distinguishing features to manufacturing that are different from agriculture and from services, but there's also a lot of variation within manufacturing and within each of the sectors. And in my view, that heterogeneity has actually grown over time. It's higher now than at the time when some of these approaches were originally being developed. And I'll come back to this later on in the presentation. I guess going along with that is that with that heterogeneity within sectors, the different kinds of activities within sectors tend to play very different roles within the economy and within growth. Let me just. And I think perhaps this heterogeneity is at its clearest in the services sector. So we've got really different kinds of activities lumped together within services, some which can be highly growth pulling, some not. We also observe an increasing what we call a fuzziness within sector boundaries. I'm not sure whether Chris might have referred to this in his talk yesterday, or I can't remember whether he's giving another talk this year in APORDE. But I guess over time we see that the kind of the borders between sectors are less well defined than they used to. So where, for example, if you're thinking about software engineering, where does manufacturing end and where does services begin? It's not immediately apparent. Similarly, if we think about some of agro-processing type of activities, where's it part of agriculture, where's it part of services, a part of manufacturing? So there's this sort of blurring of sector boundaries, perhaps more than there was previously. And linked to that, so growing integration between sectors. Of course, there's always been integration and linkages between sectors, but this is probably higher now than it used to be. So it's not just the blurring of the boundaries between sectors, but that the linkages between sectors tend to be very strong. So even when we say, okay, this sector can be growth pulling or that sector can be growth pulling, a lot of that happens through those linkages and interdependencies. So there's no one sector that can be a kind of key driver of growth. It's also worth mentioning that, yes, so the sectors are useful, and a useful analytical basis, a useful lens for understanding the economy, but there are, of course, other relevant dimensions in which we can divide up firms and economic activity. So by size of firm, by export orientation, by degree of technological advancement, spatially by firm's location, and so on. And in some of these cases, there's a partial correlation with sectors. So some sectors tend to be more technologically advanced than others, and so on. But I guess the point here is that, yes, a sectoral lens is important, but we've also got to bring in these other dimensions depending on what we're looking at. So bringing these together, it implies that sectoral change has got a very different character and different implications, depending on which activities within sectors are shrinking and which ones are growing. And we'll come to that a bit more when we look at deindustrialization. But is the point broadly there is to say we can't just look at agriculture is X% of an economy, mining is Y%, manufacturing and so on, or this is shrinking, this is growing. It's also important to look at what kind of agricultural activities are shrinking or growing. Is it basic kind of subsistence, which has very limited growth pulling effects? Is it high-tech, export-oriented agriculture that can be very dynamic, similarly in terms of other sectors and so on? So I think broadly what I've tried to do here is to sort of sketch out, by way of background, a broad structuralist approach to development in a very short way. And then at the end here, just to bring in some sort of nuances and some sort of complexities that also need to be considered. So coming then to deindustrialization as a second sort of broad topic. And maybe just to foreground some of the details which I'll come to. So there's an ongoing debate, I would say, both analytically and in terms of policy, about whether and how deindustrialization matters. So should deindustrialization be seen as a problem, something to be addressed and prevented or reversed through policy? Or is this just a kind of a natural part of economy's development and maturation, and not a concern, or even something which could be seen as a concern but just inevitable and nothing that can be done about it? So broadly, to summarize my perspective here before we go into more details, I would say that yes, deindustrialization does matter. It matters in various ways. For growth, for employment and distribution, also socially and in terms of political economy. But we also need a kind of, we need to recognize, again, the complexities of deindustrialization in various ways, which I'll come to in the next part of the presentation, in terms of what is the best way of defining or measuring it, recognizing the heterogeneity of deindustrialization in different contexts, looking at outsourcing as a contributor to deindustrialization, and so on. So let me go straight into that. So from the broad structuralist approach which I outlined earlier, seeing manufacturing as having a special role to play as an engine of growth, this would suggest that deindustrialization, which broadly we think about as a reduction in the share of manufacturing in an economy, in the country's total employment and or GDP. So the relative shrinkage of manufacturing would from this perspective be expected to negatively affect a country's economic growth. Beyond growth, some of the literature as to why deindustrialization matters also looks more broadly, that typically, and across countries and across time, manufacturing jobs tend to be better quality than the equivalent types of jobs in other sectors. So this is not necessarily to say that the highest paid people are in manufacturing than in services. I think the opposite, actually, when one looks at the financial sector. but that for example, a semi-skilled or a skilled worker, the kinds of job which they would historically be able to get in manufacturing would tend to be superior to the kind of MAC job which they might get in services or historically in agriculture, not just in terms of wages, but in terms of job security and so on. More broadly, in terms of sort of social and political economy effects, there's international literature that looks at the negative effects of deindustrialization on poverty, on inequality, on community health, on family cohesion, and so on. And a lot of this literature is located in countries which were among the earlier ones to deindustrialize, like in the US, looking at the Rust Belts and effects there, in the UK, and Europe, and so on. So coming to some of the more detailed sort of debates and nuances around deindustrialization. The first issue which I wanted to draw attention to here is kind of what counts as deindustrialization and how to measure it. Historically, the literature on deindustrialization has focused more on deindustrialization measured through employment as a share of manufacturing as a share of total employment, and looking at that as a kind of an indicator of deindustrialization. In my view, the kind of special properties of manufacturing operate both through employment and also through output. And it's actually relevant to look at both shares and changes in both of these shares. So the manufacturing share of GDP and the manufacturing share of total employment, when one is trying to understand the kind of structural changes happening in an economy. So when one thinks back to the special properties of manufacturing that I referred to earlier, balance of payments, technology, and even more broadly, learning by doing and so on, some of these go more through an employment channel, some go through an output channel. So we do actually need to look at both to understand the state of play in an economy at a particular point of time. It's also important to recognize that the manufacturing shares, or of any sector, manufacturing shares of output and employment can change even in different directions. So for instance, if we have what I would call a productivity-driven deindustrialization, we could have a situation where productivity growth in manufacturing outstrips productivity growth in other sectors of the economy. And associated with that, then the employment share growing at a slow rate in manufacturing. That's a very different kind of phenomenon from where we just have a wholesale collapse in the manufacturing sector and people and widespread job losses just because the entire manufacturing sector is collapsing, factories closing, and so on. So I guess this is just to draw attention to the fact that changes in the shares of output and employment are really telling different things, and both need to be part of the story. So I guess this is kind of what I've just been saying, and that these different kinds of deindustrialization, productivity-driven deindustrialization from just the collapse in manufacturing, they're likely to have different causes, different effects on growth, and to require different policy responses, if any. I think linked to this, as a kind of stylized fact that I've sort of pulled together from empirical evidence across countries and across time, is that it's very rare for countries to grow their manufacturing employment while becoming more labor intensive in manufacturing. In other words, less labor productive in manufacturing. So this links in with policy debates on how to increase manufacturing employment, what are viable paths to industrialization, and so on. And it's not to say that it's impossible, but it's very rare that a country would grow its manufacturing employment whilst also becoming more labor intensive in manufacturing. So generally, where countries are growing their manufacturing employment, it's actually where manufacturing is becoming more productive, so less labor intensive, but the pace of growth is such that employment can still be generated. I'm just going to go over this part a bit briefly. So this is the second sort of complexity of deindustrialization I wanted to draw attention to. So some of the debates around deindustrialization go to say that how much of what looks like deindustrialization in the economy is actually real deindustrialization, as in a structural shift, and how much of it is just a reallocation of jobs from manufacturing to services. For example, in this is from a case study I did was a couple of years ago. So as you can see, the dates are a bit outdated, but I think the point still remains. Using the case of cleaners and security guards in South Africa. So previously, they would have been mainly employed in manufacturing firms. So the security guard or the cleaner would have been a direct employee of let's say, a car manufacturing company. Over time, we've seen this shift, and an international one as well, where those kinds of services tend to be outsourced to specialized cleaning companies or security guard companies or whatever. And then the same people or the same positions, even if it's not the same individuals, are then counted as services workers rather than manufacturing workers. So this can be one factor which can be part of the apparent deindustrialization when we look in terms of employment. So looking at this case study from South Africa, just these two occupations alone account for about 44% of growth in services employment over this 6-year period. And by my calculations, about a fifth of the total growth in private services employment over this period can be attributed simply to the outsourcing of these two occupations. So this would suggest that in the case of South Africa, over this particular period, there was what we call a statistical illusion element to what shows up in the employment stats as deindustrialization. But of course, this doesn't detract from the fact that over a long term, in the case of South Africa since the early 1980s, there has been a trend towards deindustrialization. More broadly, and stepping back a bit from the details here, the extent to which there is this outsourcing as a contributor to deindustrialization, one implication is that services employment might not be as dynamic as it appears. So insofar some of that growth is just the kind of reallocation of jobs. And this sort of outsourcing wouldn't necessarily position services to be a really dynamic engine of growth. These are kind of the low-hanging fruit, and not particularly growth pulling. So the kinds of services which tend to be outsourced. So even when we look at the relative shrinkage in manufacturing or relative growth in services, again, it's important to drill down what are the kinds of activities which are driving that, and what does it tell us about the potential of those activities for growth pulling. Then to come to the next sort of dimension of deindustrialization, and which is heterogeneity within sectors, and this links to what I tried to introduce in the earlier part of the lecture, looking at the structuralist perspective and kind of the limits of a sectoral approach. So as we've said there, that activities within sectors play really different roles in the economy and in growth, and particularly when we look at services. So, for example, comparing high finance with domestic work, with public health or public education, all of these being included within the services sector, but playing really different roles in the economy. So when we say services is growing, what is it that's growing? Is it public health and education? Is it a case of financialization? Is it a case of informal retail, which is growing, and so on? So this implies that deindustrialization that might look the same, just looking at the numbers, manufacturing dropping by this percent, services growing by whatever, has got a really different character and different implications depending on what are the kinds of activities within sectors that are shrinking and growing. So is it a deindustrialization in the form of financialization, or deindustrialization as a shift to kind of low value added retail, or whatever. Then coming to the next part of on deindustrialization, I wanted to talk a bit about premature deindustrialization. So here, this refers to deindustrialization that kicks in at low levels of income per capita than would typically be expected based on international experience. And I'll kind of formalize this definition, I think, in the next 1 or 2 slides. I'm using a chart. One of the kind of typical differences between premature deindustrialization, which happens in developing countries, and the kind of deindustrialization which would typically happen like in an advanced economy, like in Europe or the US a couple of decades ago, is that deindustrialization in advanced economies tends to be more kind of incremental with the gradual maturing of those economies. In some cases also triggered by policy, as we've seen, for example, in the Reagan era in the US and Thatcher in the UK. But generally it tends to be more incremental. Whereas in developing countries, premature deindustrialization is typically triggered by trade liberalization, so reducing tariffs and like high inflows of imports, or a shift towards more austere monetary policy, high interest rates, leading to closures of manufacturing firms and so on. In many cases, these kind of economic reform packages associated with like structural adjustment type policies, which often tend to trigger like sort of a stepwise shrinkage in manufacturing as a shock, rather than just an incremental shift. And one of the important distinguishing features of deindustrialization when it's premature, which poses particular challenges for sustainable growth, is that when deindustrialization kicks in at quite an early stage in a developing economy, for example, in middle-income countries, less of the benefits of industrialization would have been kind of captured by the country by the time the deindustrialization kicks in. So here we can distinguish between, let's say if it's a case of the US or whatever, where they deindustrialize after a very extended period of industrialization. It's not to say that industrialization was kind of finished or that all of the benefits have been already gained, but it's at a more advanced levels of income per capita. And it's easier for those countries to also transition then into more high-tech, high-value-added services. So this is very different from premature deindustrialization in developing countries, where industrialization is still at a relatively early phase, industry at lower levels or low shares of total manufacturing and of GDP. So less of the benefits of that industrialization will have already been transmitted in the economy. And then linked to that, it's then more difficult to go into kind of high-tech, high-value-added, high-skill, high-productivity services that could perhaps be an alternative engine of growth. So generally, the literature suggests, and my view as well, is that where deindustrialization is premature, it's more likely to have more pronounced negative effects on long-term growth than deindustrialization in advanced economies. Okay, so to illustrate a bit further on premature deindustrialization with a chart. This is from a working paper of myself and Antonio, who'll be talking later in the week, deindustrialization and the inverted U and so on. And I must just mention, for some weird reason, these stated charts, when I show them on a Dell computer, the y-axis headings are showing, and when I'm showing them from my Apple, as I'm doing now, for some reason the y-axis labels are not showing. It's very bizarre. So sorry about that, but I will explain the charts. So yeah, you can look at either line. Let's just look at the dashed blue line. These are just at 2 points in time. So this is what's referred to in the literature as the kind of inverted U of deindustrialization. Initiated, first worked on by Bob Rowthorne, subsequently by Gabriel Palmer, who I think will be speaking later in the week, and others. So this is really showing, so on the y-axis is the share of manufacturing, in this case in employment, but we can also look at it in terms of GDP. And on the x-axis is a country's GDP per capita. So this is based on, in each case, it's based on a cross-country regression for a particular year, in this case 2005, the red, 2015 in the blue dashed. And it's showing really the stylized relationship between countries' GDP per capita and the share of manufacturing in employment. So what we can see is that at low to medium share, levels of GDP per capita, we find a rising share of manufacturing in total employment, showing the industrialization process, reaches a turning point and then declines. So this is the kind of the range of GDP per capita at which we typically observe deindustrialization across countries. So before I come to premature deindustrialization, just two observations comparing the 2005 line with the 2015 line. In each case, this is based on a cross-country regression of the same sample of countries at those 2 points in time. So firstly, we can see a drop in the line, notably a drop in the turning point at which deindustrialization kicks in. So this is saying that by the stylized fact of when deindustrialization is commencing, it's kicking in at lower levels or lower shares of manufacturing in total employment than was previously the case. So in 2005, we see this turning point at roughly, about 14% or so of manufacturing share of employment. Whereas in 2015, I guess about 12% or so. So deindustrialization is kicking in at lower levels of industrialization than was previously the case. We also see, I'm not sure how clear it is here, but anyway, it's a leftwards shift in the turning point. So deindustrialization is also kicking in at lower levels of income per capita than was previously the case. So to kind of formalize a definition of premature deindustrialization that I've been speaking about more loosely, I've suggested that we can count this as countries that are meeting these conditions. Firstly, the share of manufacturing in employment and GDP declining. Secondly, that the country falls below the curve at any point in time. So a country that falls below this curve, it implies that their share of manufacturing in employment or GDP, depending on what you're looking at, is less than what would be predicted based on their income per capita. So take an example, a country that's sitting here, it would suggest that by stylized international patterns for their level of GDP per capita, they would be kind of predicted in the simple regression to have a share of manufacturing, which is here. So if the country is down here, they've got a bit less than what's predicted. If they're above the curve, they've got a bit more than it would be predicted. So we also say that for a country to be considered a premature deindustrializer, they also have less manufacturing than would otherwise be predicted, and also to the left of the turning point. So for example, for the 2015, the turning point must fall somewhere around here. So for we can distinguish the premature deindustrializers as those at a level of income per capita, which is to the left of that turning point. So countries to the right of that, they might still be deindustrializing, but we can't really call them premature deindustrializers. Can see something in the chat. Let me just take a look. Oh, okay, it was a direct message. That's fine. Okay. So just pulling out from that, this next chart is showing the distribution of countries really based on the regression results, which are summarized in the curve in the previous chart. So what we've plotted here on this x-axis is for each country, it's the change in its share of manufacturing employment over that same period, in this case 2005 to 2015. So for countries that are over here, it means that their manufacturing share in total employment was growing over this period. And for countries to the left of this axis, their share of manufacturing total employment was declining. Then on the y-axis, and again, sorry that the labels are not showing, I know it's really bad, it's really showing the residual from the regression that yielded this curve. So what it essentially means is that countries which are up here, in other words, above this x-axis, have more manufacturing than would be predicted based on their level of income per capita, and the opposite below here. So let me explain that a little bit more in relation to the quadrants, and please feel free to jump in if I'm failing to explain it well. So countries in this quadrant over here are countries which we've called ahead and speeding. So they are they have their manufacturing share of total employment is growing. In that sense, we call them speeding, and they're ahead in the sense that they have more manufacturing than would be predicted based on their levels of income per capita. And here we find a lot of East Asian countries, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh, even Indonesia, even India, as well as a South Asian country, and so on. So these are the kind of dynamic industrializing countries. In this quadrant over here, we've called it ahead but slowing. So these countries are ahead in the sense that they have more manufacturing than would be predicted based on their income per capita, but their manufacturing share of total employment is shrinking. So you'll see a lot of the blue dots here, blue being basically Europe and North America. So these are countries which have been heavily industrialized, and countries like Germany. So manufacturing is shrinking in those countries, but they still have more manufacturing than would be predicted based on their income per capita. In this quadrant here, it's countries which are we've called behind but speeding. So they're kind of under-industrialized for their level of income per capita, but they're speeding, so they are growing. Here we find some African countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda. And then, this is like the worst quadrant to be in from a sort of structuralist or industrialization perspective. Here we find South Africa, Chile, Zimbabwe, Uruguay, the UK, and so on, which are deindustrializing and also already have, so they have less manufacturing than would be predicted, and they're also deindustrializing further. Then drilling it down a bit to the subsectoral dynamics of deindustrialization. So I think I've made the point a couple of times in the presentation about the importance of looking not just at sectors as a whole, agriculture versus manufacturing and so on, but looking at the diversity within those sectors. What are the kinds of activities within each sector that is shrinking and growing because of that heterogeneity, and so on. So here what we've done is to break down the overall trend in manufacturing by separating manufacturing into three parts: low tech, medium tech, and high tech manufacturing, and doing that same classic inverted U exercise for those three categories of manufacturing. So for low tech manufacturing, we find something pretty similar to that classic inverted U, actually even more hump shaped, showing that for low tech manufacturing, the share of manufacturing, of low-tech manufacturing in employment tends to rise up to a certain turning point and then decline. For medium tech, which is this red dashed line, we find still a bit of a non-linear relationship, but without the declining part, right? So it's the beginnings of an inverted U, but it's really just flattening off here. So for medium tech manufacturing, it doesn't go into the declining part of the inverted U. So even as income per capita rises, we don't find medium tech manufacturing dropping off. And again, this is stylized across countries at a particular point in time. And then for high tech manufacturing, really interesting, we see it almost like a straight line, not even leveling off. So this suggests that for high tech manufacturing, there's no inverted U, the classic inverted U of manufacturing, that even as levels of income per capita rise, countries tend to grow their share of high-tech manufacturing. And this is in both employment and in GDP. I'm not showing both here. So there's no kind of deindustrialization in terms of high-tech manufacturing. So to illustrate that with three particular sectors here, don't really worry about the two curves. It's just at 2 points in time, but just picking out a particular sector from each of low tech, medium tech, and high tech. So, for example, here for clothing, we're seeing that classic, very pronounced hump, inverted U, that after a certain level of income per capita, the share of clothing in countries' GDP and total employment definitely declines. For this example, for medium tech, which is rubber and plastics, here we can actually see an interesting change in the two periods of time. So in 93, which is the solid red line, we see it just starting to level off, but not even declining. And then by 2010, we begin to see the leveling off there. So this is suggesting that these high income countries by 2010 are no longer growing in rubber and plastics at high levels of income per capita. And then contrasting this with what's probably the highest tech sector of manufacturing, medical equipment. Here we actually see it's non-linear, but in the opposite direction. So it's actually going up. So this shows that at high levels of income per capita, there's actually more of countries' employment and GDP that is involved in the production of medical equipment and at an increasing rate. So there's no deindustrialization when it comes to these high-tech sectors. So it suggests that even for advanced economies, yes, overall they're having a trend of deindustrialization, but it varies a lot by sector. Okay, I think I'm going to jump some of this. And just kind of make a few concluding remarks on deindustrialization. So broadly, I would say, does deindustrialization matter? I think it is something that needs to be a concern both analytically and from a policy perspective. And when policymakers are looking at a deindustrialization trend and developing responses, it's also important to pay attention to these various dimensions which I've spoken about. Looking not only at trends in employment, but also in output, and really taking those together to see, is this productivity-driven deindustrialization or just a collapse of the manufacturing sector? Also looking both at levels and at shares. Also understanding how much of what appears to be deindustrialization is really an underlying structural shift, as opposed to just a statistical illusion from outsourcing. And what is the nature of the kinds of activities which are shrinking and expanding in each sector? So is it the kinds of manufacturing which are declining? Is it a high tech, really productive, growth pulling manufacturing, or is it sort of grandfather industries? And similarly within services, what are the kinds of activities which are growing? So I think broadly, the point remains that deindustrialization is a concern. It's important to then drill down to these kind of dynamics, appreciate the heterogeneity across countries, and formulate policy responses that take these kind of specificities into account. I think I'm going to skip this policy part just because of time. Okay. So then I wanted to talk a bit broadly about what I think are some of the emerging developments in relation to structural change and industrialization. Obviously, some of these perspectives were developed some decades ago originally and have been developed further since then. So it's important to kind of keep our thinking current on it. So here I wanted just to draw attention to what I see as some, obviously not all, it's not comprehensive, of some of these developments, which I think are interesting both from a policy and a research perspective. So these are the issues that I'll be commenting on now. The first of these is something which I've spoken about earlier and wanted just to comment a bit more here, which is the changing boundaries of the industrial and activity specificity of sectors. So without repeating what we've talked about earlier, I've alluded to the fact that there's greater sort of fuzziness on sectoral boundaries and greater integration among sectors than used to be the case. And a greater degree of heterogeneity in the kinds of activities within sectors. So this suggests we need to look at both dimensions, sectors and activity specificity. And an example of this is Chris's work. I'm not sure whether he talked about it or we're still going to talk about it on the industrialization of freshness, which he and John Sender have been writing about. Where they look at parts of agriculture which are now more kind of akin to manufacturing, have some of the properties and advantages of traditional manufacturing, and that we don't have to just look at it's agriculture, it's manufacturing, but the nature of activities within each. So this suggests that even from an industrial policy perspective, industrial policy needs to go beyond the manufacturing sector. We need to have industrial policies for agriculture, industrial policy for services, and so on, and also to take account of the sort of fuzziness and integration between sectors. Then secondly, looking at value chains. Of course, value chains are not a new development by any means. But I think it's clear that value chains have become increasingly important and are continuing to grow in importance internationally over time. Some of my comments here are drawing on a piece by myself and Antonio, other work of Antonio, and also some of the work by Lindsay Whitfield. So we can observe this rise in GVCs over time, associated with the increasing importance of intra-industry trade in intermediate goods. And some of the literature argues that what's been called vertical specialization industrialization through GVCs challenges these old sort of dichotomies between import substituting industrialization and export-oriented industrialization, because it doesn't really fit neatly into those categories. One of the features of GVCs is that very powerful lead firms, which are typically based in advanced economies, tend to control largely market access, as well as material and knowledge flows within GVCs. In terms of the implications for industrialization, on the one hand, GVCs can kind of make it a bit easier for low-income countries, which are not yet very strong in manufacturing, to break into the manufacturing sector. in the sense that to be involved in a GVC, a country doesn't have to participate in all segments of the GVC, and typically wouldn't. It doesn't have to produce a car. It can produce one component of the car. So it makes it easier for countries with very weak manufacturing sectors to kind of get a foothold in the easier segments of a value chain, even where they don't have the capability to produce along the entire value chain. But this does also bring the risk for firms and for developing countries of getting stuck in the low value added parts of value chains. And yeah, associated with this risk of getting stuck in those low value added parts of value chains, Lindsay Whitfield here has argued that this can also weaken the growth pulling potential of manufacturing. So if you remember earlier in the presentation, when I outlined from a structuralist perspective, the view of manufacturing and as playing a particular role as an engine of growth. Some of this perspective on value chains suggests that where firms in developing countries are kind of stuck in those low value added, low productivity parts of value chains, it actually weakens the growth pulling potential of manufacturing in a couple of ways. So that's part of the basis for the growth pulling potential of manufacturing is based on this notion that there's stronger increasing returns to scale in manufacturing than in other parts of the economy. But that where there's a reliance on exporting through GVCs, there's less of the benefits of increasing returns to scale, because even where a firm in a developing country has increasing returns to scale in a part of the value chain, the benefits and the gains from that would tend to be captured by a lead firm based in an advanced economy, rather than then being plowed back into reinvestment and upgrading within the developing country. This kind of model of value chain integration can also weaken domestic linkages. So as we said earlier, part of the notion of the growth pulling potential of manufacturing is having stronger domestic intersectoral linkages than other sectors, in particular backward linkages. But where we have manufacturing in the domestic economy, which is, I would say, excessively focused on particular forms of integration into GVCs, there can be those weaker backward linkages, because the inputs into that value chain production are coming from elsewhere, from another country. Firms are then doing their value add, and that's being passed on to firm in another country for the next stage in the value chain. So the domestic backward linkages tend to be weaker. So again, that can kind of weaken the growth pulling potential of manufacturing, and can also weaken the link between manufacturing and innovation. So again, as we said earlier, part of the role of manufacturing as a kind of engine of growth is seen as deriving from more innovation, technological progress, and so on. But where that kind of R&D and innovation is happening, not in the manufacturing firm in a developing country, but in head office somewhere else, that can weaken that contribution of manufacturing through technological progress. So for instance, where manufacturing firms in a developing country are just involved in very basic final assembly activities, yes, it brings benefits in terms of generating or contributing to the balance of payments, generating employment and so on, but not really as an organic driver of industrialization and structural change. So this kind of model, which is excessively focused on particular types of integration and value chains, can be associated with what can be called like thin industrialization. So yes, there is industrialization, there is manufacturing production, but it's not really driving structural change. And we could actually see a sort of unfortunate combination of global integration with domestic delinking and a kind of hollowing out of the domestic manufacturing sector. So this is not to suggest that engagement with value chains is bad, as a dead end. Is more to highlight those kinds of risks which need to be avoided by firms and governments in developing countries. And the literature has suggested different models of how to avoid some of these risks. So, for example, Kyun Lee and his co-authors have put forward what they've called an in-out-in model of engagement with value chains. So initial engagement at the early stages of industrialization, and then disengagement, that's after phase, to kind of upgrade, and then re-engagement at higher levels. That's one of the models which has been put forward. I think broadly, I would emphasize the importance of localization. So localization of production and of productive capabilities. And one of the particular challenges here is that the value chain, the sort of the segments and the activities within value chains that have the most sort of appeal in terms of growth pulling. So they have the most innovation, highest returns, and so on, are obviously those ones with the highest barriers to entry. So they're the difficult ones to get into. So this really underscores the importance of upgrading. So improving the ability of a firm or of an economy to move towards more profitable, more technologically sophisticated activities within value chains, and to gain more of the value from those. And there's different types of upgrading within value chains: process, product, functional, intersectoral upgrading. And of course, I guess, it's easier said than done. Who wouldn't want to upgrade? But it's not so easy in practice, because getting into those more appealing but difficult parts of the value chains have got higher thresholds in terms of capabilities. So it's the importance of skills development, innovation, and so on, to equip firms to be able to get into those higher value added parts. And the importance of kind of what Antonio and I have called linking up while linking back. So linking up with value chains internationally, while also linking back with local production systems, to ensure that GVC engagement can also help to pull along industrialization. And then briefly in terms of kind of technological change and the sort of the host of technological advances that are sometimes referred to under the rubric of the 4R. I mean, long before the 4R, of course, we've recognized the importance of innovation, of technology intensity, and of upgrading for industrialization and for structural change. In some ways, we can see innovation and upgrading as part of the kind of the firm level micro foundations of structural change. And it's important to recognize the relevance of this for competitiveness, for diversification, for keeping pace and for catching up, for moving towards more complex and sophisticated products, and so on. All of these depend on innovation, on technological upgrading, and also this, I guess, connects back to those charts which I was showing on the inverted U, where we broke this down by different kinds of manufacturing: low tech, middle, medium, and high tech. And we saw that medium and high tech industries, and in particular high tech industries, did not follow that classical inverted U pattern of deindustrialization. So that's again another reason that pushes in favor of technological upgrading, because if you can get into those medium and high tech industries, you're then not running the same risk of deindustrialization as when you're producing, let's say, clothing and so on. In the case of late industrializers in developing countries, or what we might even call late industrializers, in particular in low-income countries, this suggests that technological upgrading is crucial, but of course it's challenging. It's more difficult for late industrializers than for advanced economies. And this draws attention to the importance of productive capabilities. At the firm level, we can think of productive capabilities in terms of both production capabilities and technological capabilities. I think we're just going to skip some of this because of time. We can always come back to it. Let me just allude to a bit here, which sort of links the broad structuralist perspective that I set out earlier, and the kind of structural change agenda with developments in the 4R and maybe how developing countries can respond to and engage with the 4R. So I'd suggest that it's important to approach the 4R as part of an industrialization structural change agenda, not something separate. So success in the 4R needs everything that a firm or country needs to succeed in industrialization, and more. So productive capabilities in manufacturing are central to 4R success, in particular to not only adopting and using, but also even to producing 4R type of technologies. And this sort of success needs both sort of traditional industrial capabilities as well as new and emerging capabilities. And yeah, to succeed in this involves firms and countries narrowing the gap in digital capabilities and meeting the sort of the minimum thresholds that are required, well, even to be a user, let alone a producer of these sort of technologies. Yeah, I think I'm going to move on a bit to the fourth of 5 of what I set out as some of the kind of new developments. Of course, again, climate change, not necessarily new per se, but I guess there's an increasing emphasis, both within research and fortunately, even if belatedly, in policy, that really one cannot look at industrialization and industrial policy without taking account of climate change. So, yeah, there's a growing recognition of the urgency of climate change as one of the fundamental problems facing humanity. And I think we can't avoid the fact that industrialization has been and continues to be a key contributor to anthropogenic carbon emissions, as well as other types of emissions. So this suggests that many developing countries face these dual goals, amongst others, of course, industrialization, as well as the need to mitigate emissions. And it's not always straightforward as to how to reconcile these goals, because there can be tension between them. And there is potential for decarbonizing industrialization, and there's a large and growing body of work and policy and so on, including at TIPS, around green industrialization, green industrial policy. I think it's got particular both challenges and opportunities for late industrializers in developing countries. So the current advanced economies, during their own earlier phases of industrialization, obviously did not have to bother about the need to mitigate emissions. They were able to industrialize and contribute to climate change without facing that kind of dual constraint or those dual imperatives that late industrializers currently need to deal with. Okay, let me move quickly to the next one. I just thought, just to reflect briefly on some aspects of COVID and implications for industrial development and policy. I really here just want to kind of sketch out the ground a bit, because I've actually framed one of the group questions around this. So I won't go into too much of detail here. So I think over the last year and a half, we've observed various short to medium term effects of the pandemic on manufacturing firms, and it's useful just to kind of think these through categorically. There's been the direct effects on manufacturing firms in terms of affected workers, temporary firm closures, and so on. Also slowdowns in manufacturing production due to containment measures that have been put into place. So through lockdowns, as well as even when firms are operating, in some cases distancing measures that have affected productivity and output. And there's also been lower domestic demand for manufacturers, both intermediate and final goods, due to low levels of income, both domestically and internationally. And well, I guess the last one is particularly in the earlier stages of the pandemic, where there were some supply shortages in manufacturing. So kind of, thinking through, this is drawn on some work from myself and Common Naidu that we've been doing. And trying to really sort of conceptualize the differences in outcomes on manufacturing firms and on manufacturing across countries, and thinking through the different ways in which manufacturing has been affected. So I think what matters a lot is prior conditions in manufacturing. And we've been working on this both conceptually and econometrically, looking across manufacturing firms internationally, and the importance of the size of the manufacturing sector in a country, the robustness, the composition, and how tech intensive it is, the degree of diversification and complexity, and so on. So those sort of prior conditions in manufacturing, and broadly, I would say productive capabilities in manufacturing, are really crucial to the resilience of manufacturing through the pandemic. And I think from a policy perspective, that sort of draws attention to the importance of building up a manufacturing sector over time, because these are not things which you can quickly do overnight in the face of a shock, whether it be a pandemic or something in the future. And then obviously the extent and the severity of the pandemic itself, which is varied a lot across countries, the extent of the containment measures, which have also varied a lot across countries, and the effects of that on temporary firm closures and so on. And then very importantly, the economic support measures that have been provided to mitigate the effects of the pandemic and of containment effects, and try to keep firms open. And I guess that the combination of these tend to come together in helping us understanding the differential effects across countries and across firms within countries. So I think broadly, I mean, I don't want to go into too much of detail here because it's part of the group discussion, but maybe just by way of sort of headings. We can think through some of the implications of COVID for industrial policy. In my view, it does draw attention again to the importance of state capabilities. The kinds of capabilities which we can see as being important for the execution of industrial policy also have proved to be important in the management of the pandemic, both the public health and the economic aspects of it. And I think some of these sort of state capabilities are actually also built up through the practice of industrial policy. So even if it's not a direct sort of transferability, but the kinds of state capabilities that are built up through the design, the execution, the adaptation of industrial policy also prove valuable, not only on the economic support side in terms of designing measures and getting them out there to firms that need them, but even arguably in terms of some of the public health dimensions. It's these sort of capabilities are to some extent transferable. It's also drawn attention to the importance of productive capacity in manufacturing, and this is particularly in the earlier stages of the pandemic. So we can all remember the shortages and PPEs and so on. And again, productive capacity in manufacturing is something that if you don't have it, it's very difficult to build up overnight. So countries which were definitely advantaged by those which had robust manufacturing sectors that were also agile and able to adapt their production. Also brought changes in the international organization of production, disruption in some of the value chains, and I guess we'll see which firms and countries have been able to take advantage of those changes, and which will be sort of the net losers. Then I'm sure we're all familiar with the debates around building back better, and the importance that where support is given to manufacturing, that it's not just to do more of the same, but how to link that to a more sustainable industrialization path. I guess institutional coordination within countries and between countries. So multilateralism, something yeah, if this crisis hasn't underscored it, I don't know what will. But even within countries, the importance of policy and institutional coordination between different departments, different levels of government, and so on. So maybe, yeah, before I go to the group questions, let me just stop, because that's the end of my slides. I deliberately cut out some of the slides this year to try and have more time for group discussion.